How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samches, Daf 68 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, yo friends. Today's Daf is Mamish a Gewalt. It's Mamish a Gewalt. We are, okay, so yesterday, and maybe even the day before as well, yesterday before, or maybe just yesterday, I can't remember anymore, I don't know what's what. But yeah, I think yesterday we got to the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon with regard to nosayn tam lefagam. Reb Meir had said nosayn tam lefagam osir. Reb Shimon said nosayn tam lefagam mutter. Today we are going to be magdir. We are going to, at least in the first part of today's daf, we're going to discuss the context for the nosayn tam lefagam argument. The way that it sounded yesterday was that the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon regarding nosayn tam lefagam is about etzim, the concept of it. If right, we talked about yesterday, I think I don't know what's what anymore, but I think we talked about yesterday. If vinegar falls into hot beans and immediately ruins it, so there was no upside at all. It was only negative side. So is that where it sounded yesterday like that's where the machlokes is, right? That there, Reb Meir would say, nonetheless, even though it's nosayn tam lefagam, it's osir. Reb Shimon says nosayn tam lefagam is mutter. But we also had seen yesterday the concept of hishbiach ulevasof pogmo. Right? What happens if the vinegar falls into cold split beans, and initially it enhances the flavor, and only later on it's heated up and everything goes south. But initially it was beneficial. The same vinegar which ended up ruining it was initially benefiting it. So maybe only that's where there's a machlokes, but everyone would agree that nosayn tam lefagam straight up would be mutter. So anyway, maybe over there when it was initially good, that's where Meir says that it's also. So we're going to be discussing that's in the first, I'd even say 3/4, I'd say, of our daf is being magdir, the context for the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon vis-a-vis nosayn tam lefagam. And the second topic of our daf is a mouse that falls into beer. And what are the nosayn tam lefagam implications of that? So, chevre, without further ado, we are going to get started on Daf Samches of Masechta Avodah Zarah. It promises to be a very. We're going to get into it. Our hearts are going to get into it. It's going to be full of love, and here we go. Okay, Givaldig. We are going to start on Daf Samches Amud Aleph, 4 lines into the Daf. Omer Ula says, "Machlokes sheishbiach ulevasof pog." Okay, so the Agosabach changes pogam to pogame. I kind of like it, but you have to change it in the whole daf. I have a feeling I'm probably going to do some kind of a pshara, some kind of compromise where sometimes I change it and sometimes I don't. But so if it says pogam and I say pogame, it's because the Agosabach says it, but I don't know if I'm always going to say it because there's a lot of it. That's the deal. So says Ula, again, Amar Ula, machlokes sheishbiach ulevasof pogam. That the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon is when initially if we take our example of vinegar and split beans, initially the vinegar was beneficial. Initially, the vinegar was beneficial. It was cold split beans. The vinegar fell in, enhanced it. It was a delicious dish. And then they heated it up and no good anymore. So Reb Meir says, look, in that case, what do you want me to tell you? Initially, it enhanced the dish. When you heat it up later, it's going to remain osir, right? Assuming that the vinegar, of course, is osir. However, straight up nosayn tam lefagam, in a scenario where the vinegar falls into hot split beans, ruining it instantly, that's nosayn tam lefagam osir. Reb Meir would agree to that. So again, Amar Ula says Ula machloikes sheshbiach l'vasoif poigim, that the machloikes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon regarding nosayn tam l'fgam is when initially the vinegar, I'm going to use the example of the vinegar and the beans, that the vinegar, the osir vinegar, initially enhanced the beans. It's cold beans. Aval pogam meikara, but if the vinegar fell into hot beans, instantly ruining the dish, divrako mutter, everybody would say nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. Esvei Rav Choga L'ula Rav Choga Asakasha Anula Yayin Shenofa L'Soich Adoshim. Wine that falls in, so Yenesech, I imagine, that falls into lentils. V'chomet Shenofa L'Soich Grisin, or osir vinegar that falls into split beans. Osir. Reb Shimon Matir. So on this daf, so we've been talking, of course, about the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon. Here it seems to be a Tanakama. Okay, we're gonna maybe even the first to the Rabbanon sometimes. So, what do you want me to tell you? Reb Meir, Rabbanon, Tanakama, they're all expressing the opinion of Osir. Okay, so we see here in this Braise that, what do we see in this Braise? That, let's say this vinegar is falling into the split beans, instantly ruining them, and we see this machloikes that the Tanakama, which I imagine is the same as Rav Meir, is saying osir. Reb Shimon is saying mutter, but we see that the Tanakama even says osir by pogem meikara, when it instantly ruins the dish. Again, it's Rav Choge L'ule, Reb Choge Asakasha an Ule, Yayin Shenofa L'Soich Adoshin, Yenesech that falls into lentils, V'chomet Shenofa L'Soich Grisin, and Osir Chometz that falls into split beans. Osir, Reb Shimon Matir, Reb Shimon says mutter, V'hacha, and in this scenario, the Pogame Karu, it's immediately ruining the dish. Uflige. And they're arguing. Omar Ula responds. He says, Choga made the yada my kamre Rabbanon to Yuvta Kamosiv. Choga doesn't know the first thing of what he's talking about. Lo made the yada, he has no clue my kamre Rabbanon. What in the world the rabbis are talking about? Because Yuvta Kamosiv, and he's asking kashas when he has no clue what he's even talking. There's no clue the first thing of what he's talking about. The fact of the matter is, says Ula, that Braise, Kigon Shenofal, L'soch Grisin, Soninin, that Braise is talking about a Shbiach, Ulevasov, Pogmo. It's talking about where the vinegar fell into cold split beans, initially enhancing them, and then and then they were later heated up, and therefore it's a shbiach ulvasof pogem, and because it was initially beneficial, that's why Reb Meir says it remains osir. However, if it was pogem meikara, if it initially ruined the dish, argues Ula, everyone would agree nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. So that is the opinion of Ula. That this machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon is not regarding etzem, the concept of nosayn tam l'fgam, when it's pogem meikara. No, everyone agrees that's mutter. The machlokes, according to Ula, is when initially it was beneficial and then later became bad. Reb Meir says it remains osir. Reb Yechanan Amar, whereas Reb Yechanan says, like, at least to me, seemed to be the case yesterday, the initial machlokes that we encountered yesterday between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon. Reb Meir says also, Reb Shimon says mutter. Rabbi Yochanan says, look, it's talking about etzin, the concept of nosayn tam lefgam. When the vinegar falls on the split beans and they're hot, instantly ruining the dish. Rav Meir still says, osur. And this seems, my impression from the Mahalach of the Gemara is Rabbi Yochanan seems to be, I think, what we accept as like definitive. That seems to be the vibe of the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan's Malach. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, and says Rabbi Yochanan bepoge meikar machlekes. Rabbi Yochanan says that the machlekes is even when, although the truth is, anyway, let me drop the word even. The machlekes is when the vinegar falls in to the split beans and they are hot, and the vinegar instantly ruins the split beans. Reb Meir still says osur, even though it's as nosayn tam lefgam as you can get. Reb Meir still says osur. Now the Gemara is now going to ask an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if interesting is the right word. It's going to be a question we're going to answer with teku for now, but we're actually going to answer it, I would say, in a few minutes, but let's be honest, I have a feeling it's going to be more than a few minutes. Well, it's definitely going to be more than a few minutes. Rabbi Yochanan Omar says, where am I? So Rabbi Yochanan Omar says Rabbi Yochanan, I think maybe I just read this, that the machlokes is even when the vinegar instantly ruins the beans. Now, you better ask a kasha. Now, do we say, is Rabbi Yochanan saying that the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon is when the vinegar falls into the split beans and they're hot, instantly ruining them? And there, Reb Shimon says mutter, but if it was initially beneficial to the beans, if the beans were cold and the vinegar enhanced the beans initially, and only later on when you heated them up did they ruin it, maybe there Reb Shimon would agree with Reb Meir that since initially the vinegar was beneficial, even when you later ruin them by heating it up, it would remain osur, right? Because when the vinegar fell into the beans initially benefiting the beans, it was osur. Maybe Reb Shimon would agree with Reb Meir that when it's later heated up and ruined later, it remains osur. Maybe the machlokes where Reb Shimon says mutter is only when the vinegar initially ruined the beans. But if they initially benefited the beans, Reb Shimon would agree with Reb Meir that it remains osur. Or maybe the machlokes is in both scenarios. That just like Reb Shimon says mutter when the vinegar falls into the hot beans, ruining them instantly, Reb Shimon says mutter. But also, if the vinegar fell into cold beans, initially benefiting the beans, well then later when you heat them up, Reb Shimon says, well, it would become osur at that point. It would become mutter at that point. He would maintain that both when it instantly ruins the beans or when it deferredly ruins the beans, in both cases, it is mutter according to Reb Shimon. Teku, we say we don't know the answer. So again, Reb Yochanan says that the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon is when the vinegar falls into the split beans and they are hot, instantly ruining them. Reb Meir says even there, osur, and Reb Shimon says mutter. The question is, what happens in the case of Ishbiachil V'Sof Pogmo? Reb Yochanan is not clear. Would Reb Shimon agree with Reb Meir that in that case it would be osur, or would Reb Shimon maintain mutter when you later on heat them up, ruining them later on? Would he say mutter there as well? And we say we don't know the answer. I'll give you a spoiler alert. On Daf Samach Beis, we are going to see that everyone agrees that when it comes to Hishbiachil V'Sof Pogmo, when it was initially beneficial, Reb Shimon agrees with Reb Meir that it's going to be also. Reb Shimon only says mutter when the vinegar instantly ruins the beans. That's where we'd say nosayn tam l'fgam mutter, according to Reb Shimon, based on Reb Yochanan, which I think seems to be kind of the way that we roll with. Wow. Okay, there's a lot here. There is a lot here. Now, if you remember, Taka, yesterday we saw, Tosfos points this out, yesterday, Taka, we had seen in the Gemara that, was this even Rabbi Yochanan himself? That was Shmuel, that if, we had said, when do we say nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter? When vinegar falls into hot beans, but if they fell into cold beans and then later got heated up, it would be osir. Right, we had said that yesterday, right? What do we say? Right, so yesterday already we had made this distinction between if the vinegar immediately ruins the split beans versus if it initially benefits the split beans and then later on ruins it, in which case we had said yesterday, Mutter said, sounds like that would basically be like Rabbi Yochanan, who's saying that the machlokas is meaning basically that would be the shita of Reb Shimon, who says that nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter when it immediately ruins it, but the shpech v'sov pogem would be also. I made this slide over here. I'm not exactly sure if it's going to be helpful or not. I don't know. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. I'm not like such a charts guy. I'm not. I find that. Some people love charts. I usually skip the charts because I find that I have to work through the charts and try to figure out what the chart is saying, and I'd rather just figure out what the Gemara is saying rather than figure out what the chart is saying. But I tried to break this down into a simple way that maybe is helpful visually. I don't know. But anyways, basically I have this slide here that says that the machlekes of nosayn tam l'fgam. So according to Ula, when it's initially yuck, when it initially ruins it, well then everyone agrees nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. When it's initially yum, when initially it enhances the dish, well that's where Reb Meir says osir. Now according to Reb Yochanan, when it's initially yuck, when it ruins it immediately, that's where Reb Shimon says mutter. But when it's initially yum, when it's initially beneficial, everyone would say osir. Okay, I don't know if that is helpful or not, but I thought I would give it a shot. Okay. Now, the concept is just kind of break it down into its bare bones, and I don't know. Hopefully it was helpful. Okay, now, where are we? Amr of Amram says of Amram, Efshir Isa laha the Rabbi Yochanan v'lo tani of masnisin. That's very. So it's a very interesting concept. It could either be really interesting or just basically interesting. What do I mean by that? So again, Amr Vam says Ravam, Efshir Isa laha Rabbi Yochanan. Is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan says such a major statement, such as that there's etzema machlokes, that this concept of nosayn tam l'fgam that I always assume nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter, and comes Rabbi Yochanan to say not true, it's actually a machlokes. Reb Meir says it's actually osir. Is it possible that there's such a yesaitis dika machlokes, and we shouldn't have it in a mishnah? There's no mishnah that has this machlokes. Again, Amr of Amram says, Efshir Isa laha Rabbi Yochanan. It's possible that Rabbi Yochanan is saying he's correct, that there's etzem machlokes on the concept of nosayn tam l'fgam. What does that say? Demukri plutai, right? Exactly. Vilotanya love masnisim. Okay, so here's the thing with this thing. Vilotanya, Tanya means Bryce, of masnisim means Mishnah. So the Goz Vitzunim says either you got to say Tanya b'masnis or Tanina b'masnisin. What I kind of was hoping it was going to be is referring to a Mishnah, because Mishnayos are more authoritative than Bryces, right? So meaning, so the point being that, like, if the It would be a super cool concept if it's like, if something is so basic, such a machlokes on etzem, the concept of nosayn tam l'fgam, it would have to be in a Mishnah somewhere. Kilu, this is something that would have to be in a Mishnah. Alternatively, it could just be that Kilu, there should be some kind of a brisa, some kind of a record of it. Doesn't have to be as definitive as a Mishnah, but some kind of a record. The truth is, I think it's going to come from actually a brisa. So I guess we seem to be happy enough with a brisa. Oh no, it looks like it's coming from a Mishnah. So anyways, yeah, if you're saying that it must be in a Mishnah, I think that's actually an interesting concept. That's such a yisoidistic machlokes must be in the Mishnais. Must be in like the official Mishnais. But anyways, the point that Rav Amram is making is that, Rabbi Yochanan is making a major assertion here that there's etzem machlokes on the concept of nosayn tam l'fgam. It must be at least in a brisa, at least in Mishnah brisa something. Nafat dog ve'ashkoch. Reb Amram went out. He did his research and what's Yogaito Matzosa Taimin. He did his research. He put in his work, and Itaka found Epis. It's not that we learned in a Mishnah, Sor Shel Chulin. If you have leaven of Chulin, so you have etzem a dough. Your dough, I don't know how to make doughs. You take flour, I guess, you mix it with water or something, and then you add some leaven. You add some leavening agent. So the dough is chulin, the leaven is chulin. Shenafal esoch isa, and it fell into a dough. V'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz ve'achmitza. Okay, everything's going good. You have a dough, it's chulin. Some leaven falls in, makes the dough rise. Everything's going great. V'achar kach nafal sor shel truma or sor shel kli hakerem v'yesh bo kedei lahachmitz. But then, curveball. What's the curveball? The curveball is while everything was going great, and you had your dough of chulin, and your leaven of chulin, and everything was rising, and it was going to be chulin, and you as a Yisrael, as a non-Kohen, was going to be able to enjoy it. But then, leaven of truma fell in, which now makes it also lizard, also to non-Kohanim, or kilei hakerem, which makes it also to everybody. It's also bano. So now leaven fell in, that was truma or kilei hakerem. Now there's way too much, there's twice as much leaven as you need. It ruins the dough. Also in the Tanna Kama says also Reb Shimon matir. And Reb Shimon says mutter. The pagame karmu me karu uflige. So what do we see? We see that everything was going great. The dish was going great. The dough was going great. Chulin dough, chulin leaven, everything's rising. Every mamish, it was a big simcha. Everything was going great. And then everything went south. Some truma leaven fell in. You didn't need the leaven. You had plenty of leaven. There's too much leaven now. It ruins the dough. So this should be a situation. Nosayn tam l'fgam poge meikar. There was never any instant when this truma leaven was doing anybody a favor, was beneficial at all. The truma or the kilei hakerem. It falls in, ruining the dough immediately, and we see that it's a machlekes. Tanna Kama says also, Reb Shimon says mutter. So here we have a Mishnah saying that etzem nosayn tam l'fgam, even when it immediately ruins the dish, or in this case the dough, is a machlokes. Reb Zera says, Reb Zera shayini isa hoil v'ru'uya l'chamea ba kama yisoy sacheris. To which Reb Zera responds, not a good proof. Why not a good proof? Because when it comes to dough, it depends how you look at it. It depends your perspective. With this particular dough, yeah, you're right. It ruined the dough. It ruined this particular dough. That's correct. But look at the bright side of things. You now have a starter. I don't know how these things work. Maybe somebody makes bread. They could give shtickle more, shed some light here. But what Reb Zera's argument is that although you ruin this particular dough, you now have a starter, you now have enough leaven to be able to leaven other bread. So while you look when you look locally, yeah, the dough is ruined by the truma or the kilei hakerem. But if you look more big picture, look at the bright side of things. You now have a starter. You now have leaven that can leaven other things. So it's not necessarily pigam. And depending how you look at it, it could be a good thing. You now have a starter. You don't have a dough, but you have a starter. So therefore, you could say that when the Tanna Kama says osir, it's because it isn't actually lifgam. If you look at the bright side of things, it's l'shvach. Now you have a starter. So this isn't necessarily machlokas about is nosayn tam lifgam by pogim meikar osir or mutter. This is a question of, do you view it as this leaven ruining this dough, like Reb Shimon would say, and he would say nosayn tam lifgam is mutter. Or you could say that the Tanna Kama who says also it's because the Tanna Kama doesn't view it as lifgan per se. He can view it as l'shvach, as beneficial, because now you actually have starter. You have leaven that you can leaven other dough, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. So now we get to a very interesting brisa, a arguably 4-part brisa. Tashma coming here, soor shel trume. Vishel chulin shenaflu lesoch ha'iza boze kidei lehachmitz uvoze kidei lehachmitz v'chimtzu osir Reb Shimon matir. Wow. Okay. So here we have a scenario. We have a dough. Okay, a dough of chulin, right? What does it say? So shel truma v'shel chulin shenaflu lesoch ha'iza. Okay, so you have a dough. Assume a chulin dough, and into the dough falls tzazamin at the same time leaven of truma and leaven of chulin, and each alone has enough to leaven the dough, and they start getting to work on their own. Okay, and we're saying here again, tashma so'or shel truma. They fell into this dough. Each leavening agent, the chulin and the truma, both have enough to leaven the dough, and they fall in together and they start getting to work. And they leaven the dough. Osir, it is also according to Tanna Kama, Reb Shimon matir. Reb Shimon says mutter. Nafal shel truma tchila. Continues the brisa and says, if the truma fell in first, and it leavened, and then the chulin fell in, the v'akol osir, everyone agrees osir, because the truma, when it fell in, was benefiting the dough. There was no chulin there at the time. It was only truma. It was leavening the dough. That's benefit. So it's also lizarim, kilu. It'll be considered truma. We're going to delve into this machlokas and really analyze it as we move forward. It's a deep brisa. There's a lot to work through in this brisa. So divrei hakol osir. If the truma fell in first, everyone says osir, lizarim. Nafal shel chulin. Now, if the chulin fell in first, kind of like the scenario that we had a few minutes ago, if the chulin fell in first and it leavened the bread and everything was going, the dough, and everything is going great, and then afterwards the truma falls in, shel kilei hakerem, or kilei hakerem falls in, osir Reb Shimon matir. So we're saying the dough is osir, and Reb Shimon says mutter. And here's pogam meikar we're arguing. Basically, the Gemara for now is essentially making the same argument that we made from the previous Mishnah, which is, right, so this brisa has 3 parts. Part 1, so we're talking about a dough, okay? The dough needs to rise. So there needs to be leavening that goes into the dough. So in the first section of the Brisa, the Truma leaven and the Chulin leaven fell in at the same time. We said it's a machlekes, Osir, Mutter. Tanna Kama says Osir, Shimon says Mutter. The second scenario in the Brisa was where the Truma leaven fell in first and was doing its thing and leavened the dough. There, everyone says Osir. And the third case is when the Chulin fell in first, did its thing, rose the bread, caused the bread to rise. It was a Chulin dough, caused the dough to rise. It was Chulin dough. And then the Truma falls in, or the Kilei Kerem falls in, ruining the dough, nosayn tam lifgam. And we're saying, Tanna Kama says Osir, Shimon says Mutter. So just like we had said from the previous Mishnah, we want to make the argument that you see, nosayn tam lifgam, even Pogei Meikar, even like over here when the Truma or the Kilei Kerem falls in, immediately ruining the dough. And we're saying, we see it's a machlokes. Tanna Kama says Osir, Shimon says Mutter. V'chitema hachinami. If you're going to say as well over here, K'di Reb Zera, and maybe, of course, then you'll answer in the same way that we answered the previous Mishnah. Like Reb Zera had said, that maybe depends how you look at it. Reb Shimon says this is nosayn tam lifgam because the Truma or the Kilei Kerem ruined the dough. But the Tanna Kama could say this isn't nosayn tam lifgam because while maybe it ruined this dough, it actually enhanced it because it makes it a leavening agent to leaven other dough. So it's not, look on the bright side of things, it's not necessarily pgam, it could be l'shvach, and therefore it's also according to Tanna Kama. So again, this isn't necessarily proof of the machlekes regarding nosayn tam lifgam when it is pogei meikara, because maybe the opinion that says Osir says this isn't actually lifgam, it could be lishvach. But Toshma mi seifa, but come here from the seifa of the Brisa. There's another part of the Brisa, a fourth part of the Brisa. You ready for this? Hayayin shenafal l'soich adoshim, like we had seen earlier, wine that falls into lentils, yenesech that falls into lentils, v'chometz shenafal l'soich grisin, or vinegar that's also that falls into split beans, also Reb Shimon matir. So Tanna Kama says also, Reb Shimon says muter v'achanami de pogei meikara uflige. And we see it's pogei meikara uflige, right? So here's this Brisa that says that yenesech fell into lentils, or osir vinegar fell into split beans. Tanna Kama says osir, Reb Shimon says mutter, and you see, this is pogei meikara. The wine is falling in and ruining the lentils. The vinegar is falling in and ruining the split beans. And we see, even though it's instantly ruined, initially yuck, instantly ruined, and we see that there's a machlekes. And now but where did we bring this Brisa earlier? We brought this Brisa earlier against Ula, who said that everybody agrees by pogei meikara that it's also that it's mutter. And Ula had said that Brisa is talking about hishbiach l'vasov pogmo. That is why there's a machlokes. So what does the Gemara say? Here we go, Chevri. You ready for this? Chevri, you ready for this? Here's going to be, this was the build-up, is all waiting for this moment, Chevri. So maybe you'll say it's like Ula responded to Reb Chaga, that machlokes by the vinegar and the yenesech falling into the, that we just said, falling into the lentils, into the split beans. It's not talking about pogei meikara when it initially ruined the thing, no. It's talking about ishbiach l'vasov pogmo. It's talking about when initially they were cold and initially it was beneficial to the dish, and only later on did they heat it up and ruin it. And that is why Reb Meir says Osir. Right, but if initially ruined it, Ula would say that everybody says mutter. But anyways, we could say that this machlokes is not talking about pogei meikar, it's talking about a shbiach l'vasov pogmo. But Chev, you ready for this? Are you ready for this? I don't hear you. You can't say that. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. You can't say that the machlokes is by ishbiach ulevasov pogma, because by ishbiach ulevasov pogma, we're going to prove right now, everybody agrees osir. When it was initially beneficial, and only later on did it get ruined by this ingredient, everyone, even Reb Shimon, agrees osir. Is there bechlal a machlokes when it was initially beneficial? No, there isn't. Even Reb Shimon agrees also when it was initially beneficial. You know why? Because remember all of the parts of this brisa with the dough. V'katani nafal shel truma tchila. Divrakol osir. In the second part of this brisa, we have this dough of chulin, and truma, leaven, falls into the dough and causes it to rise. So everyone agrees that the truma, we said there, everyone agrees osir. Everyone agrees that the truma, which will make it osir l'zarim, osir for non-kohanim, everyone agrees that when the truma fell in, it's benefiting the dough. It's shvach. It's good. It's causing it to rise. There was no other leaven in it. It was causing it to rise. So we're saying in that case, everyone agrees osir. But what about the fact that after this, the chulin leaven falls into the dough, and now there's too much leaven, and now this particular dough is going to be ruined. Now we saw Reb Shimon is only focused on this particular dough, right? It was that we want to say according to the Tanakama, we could say, well, it depends how you look at it. Look on the bright side of things, it can leaven other doughs. Reb Shimon looked at it only from this dough when he was saying nosayn tam lefgam is mutter, because he's saying this dough is ruined. So therefore, Reb Shimon, when we look at this particular dough, what happened? You had dough that was unleavened. Truma fell into the dough. Truma leaven fell into the dough, causing it to rise, which is objectively beneficial. But then what happened was, after the truma leaven fell in and rised the dough, chulin leaven also fell into the dough, ruining the dough. But what ruined the dough? It's not just the chulin leaven that ruined the dough. The chulin leaven only ruined the dough because the truma leaven had fell in before. If the truma leaven had never fallen in, well then the chulin leaven would have just rised the dough on its own. The reason why the chulin leaven ruined the dough is only because there already was truma leaven in the dough. So bring it all together. So this truma leaven was initially beneficial when there was no leaven in the dough. This truma leaven was the leavening agent, and it initially was beneficial. But in the end, when the chulin then fell in, and now there was too much leaven, the fact that there was initially truma leaven actually ended up ruining the dough, because now the truma went together with the chulin is now creating a situation where there's too much. So the truma was initially beneficial, but ended up being a problem when there ended up being too much leaven, part of that being that there's the truma leaven in there as well. So here there's a scenario of ishbiach, ulvasov pogem, not a peep from Reb Shimon. Everyone agrees, osir. So we see that Reb Shimon holds ishbiach, ulvasov pogem, osir. And therefore, this brisa of yain shnafel esoch hadashim b'chomit shnafel esoch hagris and osir Reb Shimon matir, this machlekes can't be talking about ishbiach, ulvasov pogem like Ula wanted to argue, but rather it's talking about pogem meikara. So we taka see that there's a machlekes by etzem nosayn tam lefgam. That by nosayn tam lefgam, even when it initially ruins the dish, Reb Meir still says osir. Let that settle for a minute. Why do I need these three scenarios? Which three scenarios? Well, the Bryce had the scenario where the chulin and the truma leaven fell into the dough tzazamen together. We had the next scenario where the truma fell in and the chulin fell in later. So Tosfos Taka links this together with then also the meaning. Well, that's the third scenario it's talking about is when the yenesech falls into the lentils and the vinegar falls into the split beans. So then what about the scenario where the chulin fell in and then the truma? So Tosfos actually links that together when the scenario when the truma fell together with the chulin, and when the chulin when the truma fell in and then the chulin fell in, or when the chulin fell in and then the truma fell in. Those are Tosfos doesn't link them together. Tosfos explains that the Gemara is linking them together. So there are three scenarios to review. There are three scenarios. There's a scenario when the chulin and truma leavens fell in tzazamen. Then there's the next scenario that we treat basically two scenarios as one, which is when the truma falls in first, or when the chulin falls in first. And then there's also the scenario of when the yenesech falls into the lentils, or when the vinegar falls into the split beans. So now, why do I need all three scenarios? So I understand the last scenario when the yenesech falls into the lentils or the vinegar falls into the split beans. Well, that was the kicker. That was the one where we finally brought the question to rest. That pogem, that the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon is even by pogem meikar mitziasa, and the middle scenario, which was when the truma fell in first, and then the chulin fell in first. Nami ishbiach levasof pagam divrei kol aser. So that was where we learned that everyone agrees that ishbiach levasof pogam is aser, right? The truma initially caused the dough to rise, which was good, but ultimately when the chulin fell in, the truma became a liability, and still everyone agreed also, even Reb Shimon agrees aser. Ela reisha lamali, why do I need the reisha? Why do I need the scenario where the chulin and truma leavens fell in tzazamen? Why do I need the scenario where the chulin and the truma leavens fell in together? Hashta u'maseifa deloi komashbach klal aser rabbanon. If the rabbis say that in the seifa, when the yenesech falls into the lentils, when the vinegar falls into the split beans, where it immediately ruined the dish, the Chachamim still say aser. They will never say nosayn tam lefgam is mutter. Even when it initially ruins the dish, they say aser. Well then, reisha dikamashbach mibaya. Well then, certainly in the reisha, where initially the truma was working together with the chulin, or the truma leaven was working together with the chulin leaven to rise the dough. It ended up not stopping and continuing and ruining the dough, but initially it was working together. The truma initially benefited the dough. So obviously the chacham would say aser there, right? If even a scenario like the yenesech into the lentils or the vinegar into the split beans, where it ruins the dish immediately, the chacham say aser. Certainly they'd say also where it initially benefits the dough. So Abaye Reisha Reb Shimon, it says Abaye, well, because the chiddush of the Reisha is not for the Chacham. The chiddush of the Reisha is for Reb Shimon. And this is what the rabbis are saying to Reb Shimon in the Reisha. When the truma and chulin leavens fall in together. Isa zo ru'uya lahachmitz b'shtei shos. They say to Reb Shimon, look, this dough would normally take 2 hours to rise. What's causing this dough now to be able to rise in double the time and twice the time? Isser. The Isser. The Truma leaven. So therefore, it should be also, right? Because when the Truma leaven and the Chulin leaven fall into the dough simultaneously, the Tanna Kama had said also, but Reb Shimon had said mutter. So now the Tanna Kama says to Reb Shimon, but why do you say mutter? What's causing the dough to rise in 1 hour rather than 2 hours? What's benefiting the dough in that sense, from that perspective? The Truma leaven. So it's a shpiach. It's mashpiach. It should be also. Reb Shimon, whereas Reb Shimon, kisheshbichu shneim, heshbichu kishepognu shneim pogmu. Whereas Reb Shimon looks at it differently. He says, no, it wasn't the Truma alone causing it to rise faster. It was the Truma together with the Chulin. So it wasn't the Truma alone. It was the Truma together with the Chulin that caused it to speed up. But also when it ruined it, the same thing. It was the Truma together with the Chulin. You can't isolate the Truma to say that the Truma benefited the dough. It was a joint effort, but not the Truma alone. The Reb Shimon, it's Tair Heter v'Isser ba'adei adadi v'Litzer. But okay, but according to Reb Shimon, fine, no problem. Okay, it was the Truma and the Chulin, but let them join together. Heter mitzvah v'Isser. Let's say that they all join together, and it'll be like this unit, this osir unit, leavened the dough quicker, and it should be osir. Reb Shimon the time, Reb Shimon is consistent with his reasoning. The Omar afilu iser ve'iser nami lo mitztarfi. Even two different isers don't join together. Certainly, then iser and heter are not going to join together. The Tanan that we learn in a Mishnah, Orla v'kile akarim mitzdarfin, Reb Shimon Omer ein mitzdarfin. That when you have so Orla and Kilei Akarim are both Asur Ba'ana, and they are both only become batel when it's a ratio of 200 to 1. That if you have a mixture that has Orla in it, or a mixture that has Kilei Akarim in it, well then that mixture is Asur. But if there are 200 parts of Chulin to 1 part of Orla, or 1 part of Kilei Akarim, then it is mutter. So now what if you have a mixture? It has 200 parts of Chulin and only 3/4 of a part of Orla. Well, then the Orla is batal. But what if there's also 3/4 of a part of Kilei Akarim? So, isolated, the Orla would be batal and the Kilei Akarim would be batal. But together, you have 1.5 parts versus 200 parts, and then it would be considered the Isser being more than 1 part of Isser to 200 parts of Heter. So if you said they join together, the mixture is also. Reb Shimon, however, says that the two Isurim don't join together, and then certainly Heter is not going to join together with Isser to make something also, and therefore Reb Shimon says, look, when the Chulin leaven and the Truma leaven fall in together, Reb Shimon says, I'm not going to treat it as though the Truma leaven is benefiting the bread, and therefore Reb Shimon says in that case that the dough would be mutter. However, in the scenario where the Truma fell in first, as we saw, then the Truma is benefiting the dough alone, and then the dough would be osir. And now we get up to the next section of our daf, a mouse that falls into beer. Says the Gemara, there was a mouse that fell into a barrel, into a barrel of beer. That's gross. Asu Rav, and Rav says that the beer is osir. Amur Rabban Kame to Rav Sheshes. The rabbis said this to Rav Sheshes, a mouse fell into a barrel of beer. Rav said the beer is osir. So does that mean that Rav holds that nosayn tam l'fgam is also? You have a mouse fell into beer. The assumption is that is probably bad. So it's nosayn tam l'fgam. So why should the beer be osir? I mean, the beer might be disgusting. Who would want to drink it? But I mean, I guess that's what nosayn tam l'fgam is, right? It's not like a loophole. Like nosayn tam l'fgam means that it ruined the flavor. Yeah, this mouse ruined the beer. So why should it be also? Does that mean that Rav holds that nosayn tam l'fgam is also? Omar Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes says ba'al musav Rav nosayn tam l'fgam mutter. Oh, so says Rav Sheshes, listen up, fellows. Generally speaking, Rav holds nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. Now listen up, listen up, friends. This is very interesting. B'hacha chidishu. There's a machlokes Rashi tells us how to understand this. I'm going to go with Rashi. B'hacha chidishu da mimis mois uvdilin sheminei v'afilu achi aser rachmana hilkach nosayn tam l'fgam nami aser. Okay, so this is super interesting. So says Rav Sheshes, look, Be'etzim Rav holds, like Reb Shimon, that nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. Nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. However, when it comes to sheretz, there's something very interesting, which is, kind of as I said like a minute ago, mice are, like a dead mouse is gross. The Torah doesn't need to tell us not to eat dead mice. I mean, that's gross. Nobody's going to eat it anyways. So the Torah doesn't need to tell us not to eat dead mice, and yet the Torah says, don't eat shrotzim, don't eat dead mice. So why does the Torah tell us not to eat dead mice if it doesn't really need to? So it's not to tell us not to eat it, because we won't eat it anyways. Tosfos Taka has a kasha on this, because he says, like, well, yeah, but you still need to know that if you do eat it, you're going to be over on a lot. But anyways, the way the Rashi explains it is that the Torah doesn't need to tell us not to eat dead mice. We're not going to eat dead mice. So why does the Torah tell us not to eat dead mice if it doesn't need to? Well, because it's to teach us a chiddush, which is that while normally we'll say nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter, if we're talking about a sheretz, it's also the Torah. Davka wrote not to eat sheretz is to teach us this halacha, that when a sheretz is nosayn tam l'fgam, it does not go by the standard rules of mutter. Rather, if a sheretz falls into a beer, for example, we're going to say nosayn tam l'fgam is also. Let's read that again. So, Amalu Rav Sheshes says to him, Ba'al mosav Rav nosayn tam l'fgam mutter. Like I'll tell you, generally Rav holds nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter. But ve'hacha chidishu. But here, by shrotzim, there's a chiddush. Look, the Torah doesn't need to tell us don't eat shrutzes. Of course we're not going to eat shrutzes. They're gross. I want to eat a dead mouse. It's disgusting. But even so, the Torah says don't eat dead mice. What it's teaching us, it's not just teaching us not to eat dead mice. We're not going to eat dead mice. But it's teaching us nosayn tam l'fgam nami aser. It's to teach a chiddush that even though normally nosayn tam l'fgam would be mutter, when we're talking about dead mice, aser. The rabbi said to Rav Sheshes, "Elamiato litami lachvi yovesh." Well, the rabbis then said to Rav Sheshes, "Well, if your whole thing, Rav Sheshes, is like this chiddush thing, and we're going with like the whole chiddush thing, well, then let's say that it's such a chiddush that shrutzes are." Rather, the Torah went out of its way to say that shrotzes are also to teach us nosayn tam l'fgam, that even though normally nosayn tam l'fgam is mutter, but by a shrotz, nosayn tam l'fgam is also. Well, let me suggest the following: that a sheretz should be also, should be mitame, should be tame, an avatuma, whether it's lach, whether it's yavish, whether it's a freshly dead mouse that's still fresh and moist, or whether it's a old dead mouse that's all dried out, shouldn't make a difference. Let's say that dead sheretzes are this big chiddush and they're like osir all over the place. They should also be tamei all over the place. Lach, yavish. Alom mitnat. So why do we learn in the Mishnah? Mitam and lach and mitam and yaveshin. That a sheretz is only mitame when it is moist, it is not metame. When it's yavish, but if it's such a big chiddush, let's just say it's always tame. To which the Gemara says, so if that's the case, then shichva zera. What's the word I'm thinking of? Semen. That's a good word. Rashi explains that that's also a chiddush, semen. We'd stay away from semen anyways. Why does the Torah need to say, don't touch it? So we should say, well, let's say it's a chiddush, and therefore, shichva zera should also be metame, not just lach, but also yavish. But alama tanam, why do we learn in the Mishnah? Metame lach and be metame nivation. That's just like a sheretz. It's metame when it's moist. It's not metame when it's dry. Elamais lechamim. What do you have to say? That even though, yes, shichva zera is a chiddush, but shichva zera amar achmana beru'ui la'azriya. That the Torah says shichva zera, that it's only tamei when it is fit to be mazriya, fit to fertilize. If it is, like the Torah says, it has to be fit to fertilize. If it's not fit to fertilize, it won't be tamei. And therefore, achanami will say also by dead sheretz, yes, dead sheretz is our chiddush, but b'mosam amar achmana ke'ein mosam. That the Torah says, don't touch them b'mosam. What does the pasuk say? Choshib olav mehem b'mosam yitma. So, ke'ein mosam, that they have to be moist in order to be tamei. So even though, yes, sheretz is our chiddush, and yes, even though normally nosayn tam lefgam is mutter, by sheretz you could say nosayn tam lefgam is osir. But in terms of tumah, it will only be metame lach, but not yavish, because there's a special pasuk. It says b'mosam ke'ein mosam, only when they're lach. Maskif lo Shimon min Ardoya. Shimon min Ardoya asked the following kasha: Umi mois. Shimon min Ardoya asks, but are mice really that gross? I mean, I would say so, but interesting. Kind of makes you wonder about the definition of ola al shulchan malachim. But apparently, mice are served at the table of the king. So why are we assuming that they're gross? Well, it depends what kind of sheretz we're talking about. If you're talking about a mouse, like a mouse in the city, like a mouse, yuck. Yeah, nobody's enjoying eating those. But a squirrel, now that is a delicacy. Amar Rava says, Rava, hilchasa, nosayn tam lefgam mutter. You hear that, friends? The halacha is nosayn tam lefgam mutter, like Reb Shimon, and like we generally assume, right? Whenever we see the Gemara, nosayn tam lefgam, it's always like, oh, nosayn tam lefgam is mutter. Says Rava, the halacha is nosayn tam lefgam mutter. Ve'achbar b'shichra. And when it comes to a mouse in beer, lo yadayna my time with Rav, I don't know why Rav says it is osir. I'll say either he says that the mouse of the beer is osir because Rav holds nosayn tam lefgam is osir, and we simply don't paskin like him, right? Paskin nosayn tam lefgam is mutter, or mishum, or because nosayn tam lefgam mutter v'achbara b'shircha buchem ashva. Or maybe he says nosayn tam lefgam is mutter, but the mouse in the beer isn't nosayn tam lefgam because it's actually good. It's benefiting the beer. Okay. What happens if a mouse falls into vinegar? Okay. That this taka happened by Rav Kahana, the Osir of Kahana. Rav Kahana said, Osir. Omar lei. So Rav Ashi responds to Avilo, Hau imartute imartit. In that case with Rav Kahana, meaning what happened? A dead mouse fell into vinegar. The question is the vinegar osir? Rav Kahana said that it was osir. To which the Gemara says, well, actually that case was unique because that mouse kind of fell apart. And you might then actually end up eating like a hand or something like that. Like you might actually end up eating part of the mouse. And that's why it is a problem. Tosfos asks an interesting kasha, Chavra. Tosfos asks, how do we eat honey? Chavra, listen up. How do we eat honey? There might be bees parts in there. Interesting question, right? To which Tosfos answers, well, the issue with the mouse is that there might have been some flesh on there, right? A sheretz, just like it's metame b'cha'adasha, the size of a lentil, so also you can't, it's also the size of a lentil. So there might be a bit of flesh on the dead sheretz. That's the concern. But a bee's legs is just considered like etzem, like bone. I'm not super familiar with like bones in it, but he says that because the bee's legs and stuff wouldn't actually be considered flesh, they wouldn't actually be usher. Clever, isn't that extremely interesting? And now to wrap up today's daf, Ravina Sover the Sha'ur B'mei V'chad. Ravina thought to say that the mouse in the vinegar should be batel only 100 parts to 1 part. Okay, fine. Amar lo garami truma. He wanted to say it should be no different than truma, the tanan that we learned about truma. Truma ola be'echad v'mea. A ratio of 100 to 1 to be mevatel truma that gets mixed into a mixture. Tosfos says, why not compare it to orla or kilei kerem? Because orla and kilei kerem are also ba'ano, whereas sheretz is mutter ba'ano, but also b'chila like truma. Omalei Rav Tachlifa bar Giza Ravina. Rav Tachlifa bar Giza says to Ravina, Dilma kitavlin, but maybe it should be like tavlin shel truma b'kederet dami dilo batul taimai. Maybe the dead sheretz in the vinegar should be like spices in a dish that their flavor is never batul. Rav Achai shir b'chala b'chamshin. Rav Achai said with mouse and vinegar it should require only 50 parts to 1 in order to be batul. Rav Shmuel brei the Rav Ika shir b'shichur b'shisin, whereas Rav Shmuel brei the Rav Ika said that by a mouse that falls into beer, it should be 60 parts to 1. V'uchza idividi b'shisin, and the halacha is whether a mouse falls into beer, whether a mouse falls into vinegar, it is shishim v'chein kol isurin shabatora, and also by default, all mixtures of isur beheter are judged, when we're talking about ta'am, are judged by shishim, 60 parts to 1 part, and that is the ratio we will go by. Okay, sheesh, that was a gewaldige daf. That was daf Samach of Masechta Avodah Zarah. That was gewaldig. I think it must have been a long one. I don't even know. But sheesh, that was a good one though. What did we talk about? The context for the nosayn tam lifgam argument. So we saw machlokes between Ula and Rabbi Yochanan. Ula had said when it's initially yuck, everyone agrees mutter, right? When it's mamish poge meikar, it ruins the dish immediately. Everyone agrees nosayn tam lifgam is mutter. It's only when initially yum, it's only when ishbiach ulvasof pogmo, that's where Reb Meir says. Oh, so whereas Reb Yochanan says no. Poge meikara, initially yuck, when it ruins everything initially. That's where the machlokes is. That's where Reb Shimon says mutter when it's poge meikara. But initially, yum, if it was ishbiach l'vasot pogmo, everyone agrees. Also, if it initially was beneficial, that we spent some time trying to figure out a mucker for Reb Yochanan. And then a mouse that falls into beer, Rav wanted to say that it is also unclear if it's necessarily because he holds nosayn tam lifgam is also, or because he holds that it's actually nosayn tam l'shvach. Okay, and we ended up basically with this final thing of that all isurin shabbatorah are b'shishim. I hope that you enjoyed today's daf. Have a good one. Cheers.